This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Jackie Leonard, and at 14 hours GMT on Thursday, the 1st of March, these are our main stories. President Putin says Russia has developed a cruise missile that can reach almost anywhere in the world. In France, the far-right leader Marine Le Pen has been placed under formal investigation for tweeting graphic images of Islamic State violence. And more than 70 years after the end of the Second World War, the row has flared up again between Seoul and Tokyo over Japanese mistreatment of South Korean women. Also in this podcast, it's emerged that a teenager tried to assassinate Queen Elizabeth while she was touring New Zealand in 1981. And on St David's Day, is it time for the world to embrace the Welsh language?
Hiraeth means longing. You can have hiraeth for a person, you can have hiraeth for your home.
There isn't much doubt that Vladimir Putin will be re-elected president of Russia later this month, but still today's State of the Nation speech had the ring of a campaign address. In a speech stretching nearly 2 hours, he stressed that he was up to the challenge of improving the lives of ordinary Russians. Mr. Putin also described the military advances that Russia has made recently. Among the developments, he announced what was a new generation of nuclear weapons, including a cruise missile that, he said, could hit anywhere on the planet.
A low-flying, difficult-to-spot cruise missile with a nuclear warhead, with practically unlimited range and an unpredictable flight path, which can bypass lines of interception, is invincible in the face of all existing and future systems of both missile defense and air defense.
Our correspondent Jonathan Marcus has been providing analysis on defence and security issues for the BBC for more than 30 years. Emilio Sampedro asked him what he made of the speech.
Mr. Putin's comments come, obviously, just a few weeks after America has set out Mr. Trump's plans for the modernisation of the US nuclear arsenal. And what was particularly interesting, I think, in his comments is that he spoke of 2 new weapon systems that he believed meant that America's anti-ballistic missile defences, which is, of course, something that gives the Russians neuralgia, would make these defences irrelevant in the future.
And what were these weapons?
Well, they're interesting. One of them is essentially an unmanned underwater vehicle with a nuclear-armed tip. You could really say it was a very long-range nuclear-armed torpedo. The other weapon seems to be more of a work in progress. Mr. Putin talked about successful engine trials and so on. He referred to it as a cruise missile. Given the fact that he spoke about it being able to evade anti-ballistic missile defences and so on, and to be able to strike almost anywhere in the world very, very quickly, it's possible that he could be referring to what's called a hypersonic weapon, which is fired up into the outer atmosphere. It then glides along the Earth's atmosphere at extraordinary speed. It's a technology that the Russians, the Americans, the Chinese are all exploring. One arms control expert described it to me as a kind of hang glider on steroids, but it goes very, very fast. It has a completely different trajectory to a ballistic missile and therefore, again, would be able to evade those sorts of defences.
This part of the speech was very carefully choreographed. I mean, there were video displays and graphics about these projected missiles and these weapons that were up and coming in Russia's arsenal. It sounded like something a bit out of the Cold War almost.
Well, we are sort of back into a mini Cold War. I mean, like Mr. Marx said, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself in quite the same way. I wouldn't say that this was necessarily farce either. It is serious. But look, you have a situation here where clearly tensions between Russia and the United States are much greater than they have been over recent decades. You have a new American president with a very different style who talks about a strong America. So I wouldn't say it's quite exactly like the first Cold War, but there is now an era of great power competition. And as much for his audience at home, I think, as for the outside world, it clearly benefits Mr. Putin, as it benefits Mr. Trump, to wave the flag, because clearly that has a great weight at home, irrespective of the message that it sends abroad.
That was Jonathan Marcus, our defence and diplomatic correspondent. To France now, where prosecutors have put the far-right leader Marine Le Pen under formal investigation for tweeting graphic images of Islamic State atrocities. From Paris, Hugh Schofield reports.
In November 2015, Marine Le Pen posted 3 shocking images on her Twitter account, which at the time had around 800,000 followers, with her text reading, "This is Daesh," the name the French use for Islamic State. The pictures were of individuals tortured and killed by the group in horrific circumstances. Marine Le Pen argues that she put out the images to denounce a comparison made by a popular radio presenter who'd said that so-called Islamic State and the far-right Front National shared an interest in promoting division between French people of different origins. But there is a law in France that bans the broadcast of violent images liable to harm human dignity, and she now faces the strong possibility of a prosecution and trial.
That was Hugh Schofield in Paris. Now, earlier this week, we told you about the murder of a Slovak investigative journalist. Jan Kuciak was found shot dead along with his fiancée in their home on Sunday. His final and unfinished report was published posthumously on Wednesday. Its headline, "Italian Mafia in Slovakia, its tentacles reach as far as politics." Today, Thursday, police in Slovakia have reportedly raided the homes of several Italian businessmen named in Mr. Kuciak's report. 3 are said to have been detained. Our correspondent Rob Cameron is in the Slovak capital, Bratislava.
Well, nothing at the moment, at least, has been confirmed. That's it's obviously very important to stress. This information is all appearing on the Slovak media, Slovak news websites, accompanied, though, by photographs and videos. So what they are saying is that 3 Italian nationals living and working in the east of Slovakia have been arrested, and one of them, crucially, is the figure who is central to this story. His name is Antonino Vadala. He is a businessman that the journalist who was murdered, Jan Kuciak, alleges was connected to the notorious Calabrian crime syndicate, the Ndrangheta. And he is, again, alleged to have been involved in massive embezzlement of EU agricultural subsidies. Certainly, we know it's a matter of public record that several of these men, including Antonino Vadala, did have business relationships with several figures who are close to the government of Prime Minister Robert Fico. One of them, Maria Troszkova, who was until Wednesday Mr. Fico's senior state advisor. Another is believed to be connected to the government's former secretary of the National Security Council. Both of those 2 people absolutely deny any wrongdoing or any knowledge of Italian mafia or crime or anything like that, but they have both now stood down temporarily until the police can investigate this case.
Rob Cameron in Slovakia. As we record this podcast, it's 10 days since more than 100 Nigerian schoolgirls were abducted in the northeast of the country. It's thought most likely that the kidnappers were Boko Haram Islamist militants, the same organisation behind the abduction of the Chibok girls in 2014. More than 100 of them are still in captivity. While in Dapchi, families await news, the Nigerian army and the police have been engaged in a public spat over who was responsible for protecting the town. Our correspondent Stephanie Hegarty has been sending us reports from Nigeria since the girls went missing, and she sent this from the town of Dapchi.
I'm standing in the centre of the compound of Dapchi Girls' Secondary School. This place should be full of the sounds of girls laughing, playing, studying, but it's hauntingly quiet. As we're walking into the school, I can see sets of sandals dotted just along the path. So many of them. I wonder if girls lost them as they ran.
Fatima
Awol was with her best friend Zara when the militants came. They had just collected their dinner and were about to eat when they heard gunshots.
One of the teachers told us to come out, and that's when we saw the fire shooting into the sky. Many of the girls were screaming. We were running towards the gate. As we were running, the militants were shouting at us to stop. They told us to get into trucks, that they were there to help us, but we just ran.
As she was running, Fatima lost her best friend. Zara is 14, just one of 110 girls who were taken that night. All over this small town, families are grieving. Juluri Mohammed had 2 girls in the school. One escaped, one is missing. She's angry at how authorities have dealt with parents. 2 days after the kidnapping, the government said that some girls had been rescued. The following day, they said that rescue never happened. The government now says the army is in pursuit of the girls and is doing everything it can to find them. 2 years ago, I went to Chibok. It was the 2nd anniversary of the infamous school kidnapping in that town. The scene here in Dapchi is chillingly similar. Since then, some of the Chibok girls have been released. But that won't reassure the parents of Dapchi, who are afraid that they too will have to wait years to see their daughters again. That is, if they see them at all.
That was Stephanie Hegarty in Dapchi, northeastern Nigeria. Now stop playing with your phone for a minute and pay attention. We've got an interesting story here about how more than 120,000 students in Scandinavia have been persuaded to spend less time on their phones. How? By an app, of course, on those very phones. It's about to be rolled out in the UK too, and our technology reporter Jane Wakefield told Emilio Sampedro all about it.
Well, it's basically been developed by 3 students who met at the Copenhagen Business School, and they really were worried about this device distraction. So they came up with this idea that students could accumulate points and then spend them on things. So on this particular app, you accumulate 10 points for every 20 minutes that you don't touch your phone. And to put that in some sort of context, 300 points would earn you 2 free cups of coffee. So that equates to about 10 hours off of your phone. So, you have to work at it, but I'm not sure how many people...
We all have to work at it and work at it very, very hard. How damaging can this mobile phone habit be?
Well, I think there's a growing concern, anecdotally, amongst psychiatrists and health professionals that there's a definite link between the amount of time you spend on your device and growing rates of anxiety and mental health depression. There was a study from the University of Texas last year which suggested that even having your smartphone within eyeshot can reduce productivity and slow down your response speeds and potentially reduce grades. So, there is a mounting body of evidence suggesting that we really do need to cut the time that we spend on our devices.
But we need the phone too, so badly. How has this app been received in the countries it's already been launched in?
It's already had more than 120,000 users across Norway, Denmark and Sweden, and it's now rolling out in 170 universities initially across the UK, so it will be interesting to see whether the British are as good at putting their phones down as the Scandinavians.
That was Jane Wakefield, our technology reporter. Now, before we go on, I must tell you that the Assassination podcast is reaching its conclusion. Owen Bennett-Jones has been investigating the death of one of the world's best-known politicians, Benazir Bhutto of Pakistan. The last episode includes interviews with those accused of her murder. It is a fascinating series, and you'll find it if you look for The Assassination wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come in this one, the simmering row between Seoul and Tokyo over the enslavement of South Korean women during the Second World War. But first, conditions in Yemen are desperate. It has endured 3 years of conflict between Houthi rebels backed by Iran and forces loyal to the former president backed by Saudi Arabia. Despite Saudi airstrikes and a naval blockade, the Houthis remain in control of large parts of the country, including the capital, Sana'a. Caught in the middle, of course, are the country's civilians, more than 20 million of whom need humanitarian help. It is incredibly hard to get into Yemen to report the story. The BBC's chief international correspondent Lise Doucette travelled with Saudi and Yemeni government forces to the front lines.
High above the Arabian Peninsula, just off the coast of Yemen. Saudi Arabia and its allies have ruled these skies since this war began. And they control the seas below. These shipping lanes a vital gateway for the world's energy supplies. And a smuggling route too for illicit goods. Among them, the Saudis say, weapons its arch-rival Iran supplies to Yemen's Houthi fighters. We land on board HMS Makkah, a Saudi warship inspecting vessels bound for Hudaydah port. Most of Yemen's imports flow through there, but it's in Houthi hands. So Saudis are on the lookout for suspicious vessels. For Captain Musfar al-Shamrani, his mission is a crucial front line in this war.
So here on this bridge, where there's about a dozen men working on these screens with you, do you have a rapid reaction in case something suspicious is spotted?
Yes, we have people round the clock, in fact, with the 3 shifts daily.
So your operational rules are to treat all vessels as suspicious?
Yes.
You're on the front line in the most important war for the Saudi kingdom.
I'm so pleased and I'm so honored by this position to be here in the first line with my brave people and brave crew. We are so honored.
But this war grinds on. And on the ground, it's Yemen's army, troops and tribesmen who are battling Houthi fighters.
We're sitting in the back of a pickup truck packed with Yemeni soldiers. We're moving up this rocky terrain, forbidding landscape that Yemeni soldiers and their powerful allies have been fighting on for nearly 3 years to take back territory taken by Houthi forces.
Only about 10 miles from here, Sana'a is now in their sights, but still out of reach. General Nasser al-Dabani knows a tough battle lies ahead. He tells me his men know how to fight on this harsh mountain terrain. It will be hard and take time, but says it won't stop their advance.
The capital, Sana'a, is the prize in this war. The Houthis want to keep it. The ousted government wants it back. But to take the fight into the heart of this historic, densely populated city would be a bloody urban battle.
All roads in this war lead to this capital. Yemeni forces and their allies have an ambitious plan: surround Sana'a and force the Houthis to surrender. But their enemy is well entrenched. Supported by Iran, the Houthis are now well trained and well supplied. Their ballistic missiles have reached the heart of the Saudi kingdom. And fear is part of their arsenal too. Hundreds of journalists and political opponents have been detained arbitrarily. Many have fled. There's no escape from this war. The Arab world's poorest nation, now a battleground for regional powers in a Middle East which grows ever more combustible. Saudi Arabia and Iran know they're playing with fire.
Our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette, who went to the front lines in Yemen, travelling with Saudi and government forces. The long-simmering row about the wartime sexual abuse of South Korean women by the Japanese army has flared up again. The women were forced into sex slavery in military brothels during the Second World War, and in his strongest condemnation yet, the South Korean President Moon Jae-in has described it as a crime against humanity. That has prompted angry reaction from Japan. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reports from Tokyo.
This is President Moon's strongest criticism of Japan and the comfort women issue since he came to power last year. In Tokyo, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga immediately fired back. The president's remarks were, he said, extremely regrettable. In 2015, the Japanese government reached an agreement with President Moon's predecessor. Japan made a formal apology and set up a $10 million fund to take care of the surviving former comfort women. The Japanese government insists that agreement was a final settlement and that the matter is now closed. But President Moon has described the deal as wrongful and says Japan needs to make a heartfelt apology.
On the issue of comfort women, as the perpetrator, the Japanese government shouldn't say that it's over. Wartime crimes against humanity can't be swept under the rug by saying it's over.
During World War II, tens of thousands of Korean women were recruited to work as sex slaves for Japanese soldiers fighting in China and Southeast Asia. Some of the women were tricked by recruiters offering work, but many others were taken by force and kept in military brothels, known euphemistically as comfort stations.
That was Rupert Wingfield-Hayes in Tokyo. In 1981, Queen Elizabeth was on a royal visit to New Zealand when there was an assassination attempt, but it was never made public. Now, newly declassified intelligence reports have confirmed that a teenager with a rifle was arrested at the time. More from our correspondent, Howell Griffith.
The Queen was visiting a museum in the city of Dunedin when 17-year-old Christopher Lewis took aim with his rifle from a toilet block on the 5th floor of a nearby building. He missed, but the shot was enough to alert some witnesses who were later told that they'd heard the sound of a council sign falling over. 37 years on, intelligence reports have been released which confirm that it was a genuine assassination attempt. Christopher Lewis was questioned about his anti-royal views and possible terrorist connections, but he wasn't charged with attempted murder or treason, only possession and use of a firearm. He died in 1997. Following a new investigation by the website Stuff and allegations of a cover-up, New Zealand's police commissioner has now asked for the case file to be reviewed. It's claimed the authorities in New Zealand were desperate to avoid adverse publicity at the time, which might have deterred the Queen from making another visit.
That was Howell Griffith. Today is St David's Day, the patron saint of Wales, a country whose language is rich and ancient. It was in decline in the 20th century, but has had something of a revival, and now there are those hoping to export some of its charms. English speakers have adopted words like hygge, the Danish word roughly equating to coziness, and crack, the Irish meaning good fun. So how might Welsh enrich our vocabulary? Ifor ap Glyn is the national poet of Wales and author of The History of the Welsh Language in 50 Words. He talked Dan Damon through a couple of words we could use, starting with cwtch.
When I used to go and visit my grandmother, she would keep her treasures in the cwtch, which can be a sort of cubby hole, a place under the stairs. Hers was under the eaves of the house. But cwtch can also mean a hug. So it's quite an interesting word in that way, that it can be somewhere where you keep your treasures, but it can be a way that you sort of treasure your relationship with somebody.
A word that's very hard to define but means so much. Hiraeth. It means home, but it's much more than that.
Hiraeth means longing. I believe the Portuguese have a similar term, saudade. You know, you can have hiraeth for a person, you can have hiraeth for your home. It would be a way to describe missing your homeland, but it could be also a way to describe missing somebody dear to you.
And I think the Germans have Heimat, which is something similar. Well, it's a very special day. How is the language doing, Ivor?
The 2001 census, for the first time since records were kept, an increase in the percentage of Welsh speakers was noted. There are some 600,000 speakers, maybe more, because, of course, we have no ways of knowing how many Welsh speakers there are in the diaspora, you know, people raised, as I was, outside of Wales. I think we can be cautiously optimistic.
Ifor ap Glyn speaking to Dan Damon. And if you have any uniquely evocative words in your language that you think would enrich English, do share. Before we go, you will probably be familiar with the work of Alistair Leithhead, the BBC Africa correspondent. He has had postings all over the world, but occasionally pops up back here. I wandered over to say hello and ask what he's doing in London.
So I live in Nairobi, Kenya, and I've been back here in London for a week working on this virtual reality Nile project that we've been doing. And so, just last day in the office, packing up, ready to go back. So,
Talk me through your bags.
What we got in here? Well, this one, it's got lots of some perfume for my wife, lots of headsets for VR, so I can show everyone it. But this is the key thing, chocolate, 90% chocolate, cocoa, and 85% haggis.
You are so a man after my own heart. Haggis and chocolate.
And about 6 boxes of Yorkshire tea and some really good salt, which we don't get very easily in Nairobi as well. So, there's always a whole list from my wife every time we come back.
That was Alistair Leithhead, correspondent and connoisseur of fine chocolate, tea and haggis. And he mentioned there his Nile virtual reality project. It is fascinating, taking viewers on a 360-degree journey from the Blue Nile to the sea, through Ethiopia and Sudan into Egypt. And we'll be taking a closer look at that in the Global News podcast tomorrow. And that's it from us for now. But Oliver Conway will be back with an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you would like to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, do please send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. And one of our producers is currently in Seoul, South Korea. So if you're listening there, you can say hello in person. Just email us. It just remains for me to say Dydd Goel Dewi Hapus if you're celebrating St David's Day. I'm Jackie Leonard. Till next time, goodbye.